I learned the hard way that some people will steal anything if they think they can get away with it, even when it could literally mean life or death for someone else. February in northern Minnesota is not the time to mess around with heating fuel, especially when the Weather Service is predicting the worst blizzard in 20 years. I'm Henry Keller, and I've lived in my modest two-story house in Pinewood Estates just outside Duluth for 3 years now. The neighborhood seemed decent enough when I bought the place. Nice and quiet with reasonable HOA fees and rules that didn't seem too invasive. That was before I discovered that our HOA president, Sharon Whitmore, treated the entire subdivision like her personal fiefdom. The trouble started on a Friday morning when I was loading up my truck to head out for a week-long work trip. I'm a project manager for a construction company, and we had a major commercial build happening down in Minneapolis that needed my direct supervision. The weather forecast had been calling for snow, but nothing too serious was supposed to hit until the following Thursday at the earliest. I figured I'd be back home by Wednesday night, plenty of time to hunker down before any storm arrived. My propane tank sat in the backyard, a standard above-ground 500-gallon unit that heated my house and powered my water heater. I just had it filled 2 weeks earlier, sitting pretty at 90% capacity. That tank represented security and peace of mind, especially living in a climate where temperatures regularly dropped below zero. I didn't give it much thought as I locked up and headed south, focused on the work ahead. The job in Minneapolis went longer than expected. What should have been wrapped up by Tuesday stretched into Wednesday, then Thursday morning. That's when the weather reports started getting serious. The forecasters were now predicting a massive Arctic front collision with a moisture-laden system from the west, creating what meteorologists were calling a potentially historic blizzard event. The storm had intensified faster than anyone anticipated and was now bearing down on northern Minnesota with frightening speed. I wrapped up the last critical details by Thursday afternoon and hit the road, but I was racing against time. The snow started falling when I was still an hour south of Duluth, light at first, then steadily heavier. By the time I pulled into Pinewood Estates around 7 in the evening, visibility was down to maybe 50 feet, and the wind was howling like something alive and angry. The temperature had already dropped to 5 degrees, and it was still falling. I parked in my driveway, relieved to be home, and fought my way through the knee-deep snow to my front door. The house felt cold, way too cold. I checked the thermostat and my stomach dropped. 62 degrees and falling. The heat wasn't running. I immediately went to check the basement, thinking maybe the pilot light had gone out or there was an issue with the furnace itself. Everything looked fine mechanically, which meant only one thing: no propane. That made no sense. I'd had a nearly full tank when I left. Even running continuously for a week, I should have had plenty left. I grabbed my heavy parka and a flashlight and trudged around back to check the tank, leaning into wind that felt like it was trying to peel the skin off my face. The snow was already drifted high against the side of my house, but I managed to reach the spot where my propane tank should have been. It was gone. The concrete pad was empty except for a dusting of snow. The connection lines had been properly disconnected and capped, which meant this wasn't vandalism or some random theft. Someone had carefully and deliberately removed my propane tank using the proper procedures, which required equipment and knowledge. I stood there in the screaming wind, snow plastering against my face, trying to process what I was seeing. Who would steal a propane tank in the middle of winter, right before a major blizzard? The answer came to me with sickening certainty. Someone who thought they had the authority to do whatever they wanted. I pulled out my phone and immediately called Sharon Whitmore. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that particular tone of smug satisfaction that I'd come to associate with her HOA pronouncements. "Henry, I wondered when you'd notice," she said before I could even speak. "Where is my propane tank?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "I had it removed per HOA Regulations Section 12.4, she replied calmly. "Above-ground propane tanks must be screened from view of the street and neighboring properties." Your tank was clearly visible from the Hendersons' property and from anyone driving past on Birchwood Lane. I sent you 3 notices about this violation. "What notices? I never received any notices. I put them in your mailbox personally. 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, and a week ago. Each one clearly stated that failure to comply would result in the HOA taking corrective action at your expense." My mind raced. I'd been gone for a week and hadn't checked my mail before leaving because I'd been in a rush. But even so, this was insane. "Sharon, you can't just steal someone's heating fuel in the middle of February. Where is my tank? It's not stealing. It's enforcement of community standards. The tank has been relocated to the HOA storage facility pending your compliance with the screening requirements. Once you build an appropriate privacy fence or plant adequate screening vegetation, you can retrieve it. It's the middle of a blizzard. The temperature is dropping below 0. I need that tank right now." "Then you should have responded to the violation notices," she said, her voice hardening. "The HOA operates on a fair warning system. You were given multiple opportunities to address this issue voluntarily. Actions have consequences, Henry. People freeze to death in weather like this," I said, my voice shaking now. "I'm telling you right now, I need that tank back immediately. This is a life safety issue. You're being dramatic. You can check into a hotel until you resolve the violation, or perhaps this will motivate you to finally take HOA regulations seriously. Some people need to learn the hard way. Where exactly is this storage facility?" "That's HOA property information, available to members in good standing who aren't currently in violation status. Fix your violation and we'll discuss return of the tank. Have a good evening, Henry." She hung up. I stared at my phone in disbelief. The woman had actually stolen my heating fuel in sub-freezing temperatures during a blizzard and was treating it like a parking ticket. My house was already down to 60 degrees and dropping fast. At the rate the temperature was falling outside, I'd be dealing with frozen pipes within hours, and that was assuming I didn't freeze myself. I called 911. The dispatcher answered promptly, and I quickly explained the situation. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but this sounds like a civil matter between you and your HOA," the dispatcher said. "We can't force them to return property that they claim was removed for violation of community rules." "It's my property and I didn't give them permission to take it," I insisted. "How is that not theft?" There was a pause. "The value would be relevant. How much is the propane tank worth?" "The tank itself is worth around $1,500, but it was nearly full. The propane in it is worth another $1,000 or more, over $2,500 total." Another pause. "That would potentially make it grand theft, which is a felony. Let me transfer you to an officer." I was transferred and explained everything again to Officer Matthews, who took down all the details. His tone was more serious than the dispatcher's had been. "Mr. Keller, you're saying your HOA president admitted to taking your propane tank without your permission?" "Yes, she called it removing it for HOA violations, but I never gave permission for anyone to touch my property. And the total value including the fuel is over $2,500. At least that, probably more. It was a fresh fill. Stay where you are. I'm sending a unit to your location. In the meantime, is there anyone nearby you can stay with? That house is going to get dangerously cold. I can try my neighbors, but I need this resolved. I can't just abandon my house in this weather. Understood. An officer will be there within 20 minutes. I hung up and immediately started thinking about damage control. My house was going to get very cold very fast. I went room to room shutting doors to minimize the space I needed to worry about, then grabbed every blanket I owned and hung them over windows in the living room to provide extra insulation. I turned on the oven and left it open, knowing it was dangerous long-term but necessary short-term since I had an electric stove. I filled the bathtubs with water in case the pipes froze and I lost water service. True to their word, a Duluth police cruiser pulled up 19 minutes later, followed a few minutes after that by a second one. 2 officers made their way to my door, both bundled against the worsening storm. Officers Matthews and Chen introduced themselves and asked me to walk them through everything again. I showed them the empty concrete pad where my tank had been, the properly capped connection lines, and explained the whole situation, including my phone conversation with Sharon. Officer Matthews took notes while Officer Chen examined the site with a flashlight. The disconnection was done professionally, Officer Chen observed. Required a truck to transport a tank this size, probably a trailer. This wasn't kids messing around. Mr. Keller, do you have any documentation of ownership for this tank? Officer Matthews asked. I pulled out my phone and showed them the receipt from when I'd purchased and installed it 3 years ago, plus the recent receipt for the propane fill. Everything was properly documented. And you never received these violation notices she mentioned. I was out of town for work. I might have mail in my box I haven't checked yet, but even if there are notices, that doesn't give her the right to just take my property without a court order or something, does it? Officer Matthews shook his head. No, it doesn't. HOA rules don't supersede property law. If she wanted to enforce a violation, the proper procedure would be to fine you, and if you didn't pay the fines, to place a lien on your property and resolve it through civil court. She can't just take your belongings, regardless of the violation. What about the value issue? I asked. The dispatcher mentioned grand theft. In Minnesota, theft of property valued over $1,000 is a felony, Officer Chen explained. Given the value of the tank and the propane, we're definitely over that threshold. Combined with the fact that this created a dangerous situation during a weather emergency, this is serious. Can you make her return it tonight? The officers exchanged glances. We need to speak with her first, Officer Matthews said. What's her address? I gave them Sharon's address, just 4 houses down from mine on the same street. They told me to wait inside and try to stay warm while they went to talk to her. I watched from my front window as both cruisers drove down to Sharon's house, their lights painting strange red and blue patterns on the falling snow. They were there for nearly 30 minutes. I paced my increasingly cold living room, watching my breath start to mist in the air. The temperature outside had dropped to -2 degrees according to my phone's weather app, with wind chills approaching -30. This was genuinely life-threatening weather. Finally, the cruisers came back and both officers returned to my door. Their expressions were grim. Mr. Keller, we need to show you something, Officer Matthews said. Would you be willing to come with us to Mrs. Whitmore's property? Of course. I grabbed my parka and followed them to Sharon's house. The place was a large colonial-style home, the biggest in the neighborhood, with professional landscaping that was currently buried under snow. Sharon stood in her doorway, arms crossed, her face a mask of indignant fury. She was in her late 40s, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that screamed country club membership and too much time on community boards. "This is harassment," she announced as we approached. "I've already explained to these officers that I was enforcing legitimate HOA regulations. Henry was in violation and I took appropriate corrective action." "Mrs. Whitmore, we've been over this," Officer Chen said patiently. "Regardless of HOA rules, you removed Mr. Keller's property without his permission. That's theft." "It's not theft, it's civil enforcement. Call the HOA attorney if you don't believe me. We have the right to maintain community standards." Officer Matthews turned to me. "Mr. Keller, Mrs. Whitmore has confirmed that she hired a company to remove and transport your propane tank. She has refused to disclose the current location of the tank, stating that it's on HOA property and she's under no obligation to return it until you comply with the screening requirements." My jaw dropped. "You're refusing to tell us where my property is." Sharon's expression was stone cold. "It's secure and will be returned when you fix your violation. I don't respond well to threats or police intimidation tactics. The HOA has rights too." Officer Chen stepped forward. "Madam, I want to make sure you understand the situation clearly. The value of the tank and propane exceeds $1,000. Under Minnesota law, that makes this felony theft. Additionally, you've created a dangerous situation during a severe weather emergency by depriving Mr. Keller of his home heating system. These are serious criminal matters." "I created nothing," Sharon shot back. "Henry created the situation by refusing to follow HOA rules for weeks. If he'd simply built a fence or planted some hedges, none of this would be happening. You can't hold me responsible for his choices." "We absolutely can," Officer Matthews said, his voice hardening. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is Mr. Keller's propane tank located? And I'm going to tell you one more time, that's HOA business. You have no authority over internal HOA property management." Now, if you'll excuse me, unlike some people, I follow the rules and I'm not about to let my house freeze while I stand here arguing. She started to turn back inside, and that's when Officer Matthews's voice stopped her cold. "Mrs. Whitmore, turn around please. You're under arrest for felony theft." Sharon froze, literally froze, her hand still on her doorframe. She slowly turned back around, her face draining of color. "Excuse me." "You have the right to remain silent," Officer Matthews continued, pulling out handcuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." "You can't be serious," Sharon whispered, but her voice had lost all its commanding tone. "This is a civil matter. You said yourself it's about HOA rules." "No, madam, theft is a criminal matter," Officer Chen said. "The fact that you claim HOA authority for your actions doesn't change the fact that you took someone else's property without permission and refused to return it. That's the definition of theft. The value makes it a felony." "I want to speak to my attorney right now," Sharon said, her voice rising in pitch. "You can make that call from the station," Officer Matthews said. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back, please." I watched in stunned silence as Sharon Whitmore, the woman who'd spent 3 years terrorizing the neighborhood with violation notices and stern lectures about property values, was handcuffed and led to the police cruiser. Her husband, a quiet man named Doug who I'd barely ever heard speak, appeared in the doorway looking confused and frightened. "What's happening?" he called out. "Sharon, call Mitchell, call our attorney," Sharon shouted back as Officer Matthews guided her into the back of the cruiser. "Tell him these idiots are arresting me for enforcing HOA rules. He'll straighten this out." Doug stood there helplessly, as the cruiser door closed on his wife's increasingly panicked voice. Officer Chen walked over to speak with him quietly while Officer Matthews came back to me. "Mr. Keller, I need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. But first, we need to locate your property. Mr. Whitmore claims he doesn't know where the tank is, says his wife handles all the HOA business. Do you have any idea where this HOA storage facility might be?" I thought hard. The HOA owns a small maintenance building near the entrance to the subdivision. It's where they keep the lawn equipment for the common areas. Maybe there. Let's check it out. We drove through the blizzard to the front of Pinewood Estates, where a small metal building sat on a half-acre lot near the main entrance sign. The building was locked, but through the windows we could see lawn mowers, a small tractor, and various maintenance equipment. No propane tank. "There's got to be somewhere else," I said, frustration mounting. My house was getting colder by the minute. Officer Chen was on his radio speaking with the station. After a few minutes, he turned to us. "Mrs. Whitmore is refusing to disclose the location. She's maintaining that she's protected by HOA bylaws and demanding her attorney. We're going to need to do this the hard way." "What's the hard way?" I asked. "We need to figure out which company she hired to move the tank. Once we identify them, we can find out where they delivered it." "Matthews, get back on with dispatch and have them start calling local propane service companies. Someone moved a 500-gallon tank within the last week, and there aren't that many companies that do that kind of work." The next 2 hours were a blur of cold, frustration, and mounting worry. I ended up at the police station giving my formal statement while officers worked the phones trying to track down my tank. The station was warm at least, a sharp contrast to what my house must be like by now. I kept checking my phone, watching the temperature continue its deadly drop. -8 degrees, -12. Wind chills in the -40 range. Finally, around 11 at night, Officer Chen found me in the waiting area with news. We located it. A company called North Country Propane Services moved it last Tuesday. Mrs. Whitmore paid them to transport it to a private storage lot she rents outside of town, about 15 miles from here. The lot owner confirmed the tank is there, still full. Relief flooded through me. "Can we get it right now? The lot owner is meeting us there." "But Mr. Keller, I have to warn you, this storm is getting worse. The roads are becoming impassable. It's going to be dangerous. My house is probably down to 40 degrees by now. If the pipes freeze, I'm looking at tens of thousands in damage. I have to risk it." Officer Chen nodded. "I figured you'd say that. I've arranged for a tow truck with the equipment to transport the tank. He's willing to try it if we are. Let's go." The journey to that storage lot was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Visibility was near zero, the roads were covered in deep snow and ice, and the wind rocked the police cruiser so hard I thought we might blow off the road. Officer Chen drove with intense concentration, following the tow truck's lights ahead of us. What should have been a 15-minute drive took nearly 45 minutes. The storage lot was a fenced area filled with boats, RVs, and various equipment, all rapidly disappearing under snow drifts. The lot owner, a grizzled man in his 60s named Frank, met us at the gate with keys. He led us back to where my propane tank sat, secured with straps but otherwise undamaged. "Lady paid me 2 months' rent in advance," Frank shouted over the wind. "Said it was HOA property being stored temporarily. I had no idea it was stolen." "You didn't steal it, you're fine," Officer Chen assured him. The tow truck operator, whose name was Pete, got to work securing the tank for transport. It took another 30 minutes in the brutal cold, all of us helping where we could. My hands were numb even inside my gloves. My face felt like it might shatter if I touched it, and every breath burned in my lungs. But finally, the tank was secured and we began the nightmare journey back. It was past 1 in the morning when we finally pulled onto my street. Pete maneuvered the tow truck into position in my driveway, and we began the process of reinstalling the tank on its pad. I'd called ahead to wake up my next-door neighbor, Bill Henderson, a retired plumber who'd offered to help reconnect everything. Bill was a good guy, mid-60s, who'd never been a fan of Sharon's HOA tyranny. "Can't believe she actually stole your heat," Bill said as he worked on the connections, his experienced hands moving quickly despite the cold. "I mean, everyone knew Sharon was power-hungry, but this is criminal." "It is criminal," Officer Chen confirmed. "Literally." It took another 40 minutes, but finally the tank was back in place, properly connected, and Bill was checking for leaks while I got ready to restart the system. Everything checked out. I headed inside and went through the process of relighting the pilot light and getting the furnace running again. The sound of that system kicking on was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. The temperature in my house had dropped to 38 degrees. Another few hours and I would have had frozen pipes for sure. As it was, I'd gotten incredibly lucky. Officer Chen and Pete stayed until we were sure everything was working properly. I thanked them both profusely, along with Bill, who refused any payment for his help. By 2:30 in the morning, I was finally alone in my slowly warming house, exhausted and still processing everything that had happened. I barely slept, too wound up from the adrenaline and stress. The storm continued to rage outside, and by morning, Duluth was buried under nearly 3 feet of snow with drifts much higher. It was the worst blizzard to hit the area in decades, just as predicted. Without my propane tank, I likely would have died or at minimum suffered severe frostbite and lost my house to frozen pipe damage. Over the next few days, as the city dug out from the storm, the legal process began in earnest. Sharon was charged with felony theft and reckless endangerment. Her attorney tried to argue that she'd been acting under HOA authority and had no criminal intent, but the prosecutor wasn't having it. I learned more about Sharon's theft through the police investigation. She'd waited until I left town, apparently having noticed my departure. She'd then created the 3 violation notices herself, backdating them to establish a paper trail, and placed them in my mailbox after I was already gone. She'd paid North Country Propane Services $300 in cash to disconnect and transport the tank, telling them she was authorized by the HOA to relocate it. She'd rented the storage lot specifically for this purpose, clearly planning the whole thing out in advance. The really crazy part came out when other neighbors started coming forward. Apparently, Sharon had been systematically harassing people for years, but this was her most extreme action to date. Several residents shared stories of excessive fines, threatening letters, and even property damage that they suspected but couldn't prove Sharon was behind. Margaret Chen, an elderly widow 3 streets over, told me that Sharon had poisoned her rose bushes because they allegedly violated the HOA's approved plant list. Tom Brady, yes, that was actually his name, said Sharon had reported his teenage son to the police for suspicious behavior when the kid was literally just skateboarding in their own driveway. The list went on and on. Sharon had created an environment of fear and intimidation, wielding her HOA position like a weapon. The HOA bylaws, it turned out, did mention property screening requirements, but they also had very specific enforcement procedures that Sharon had completely ignored. Violations were supposed to be handled through a formal board vote, written notices with specific cure periods, escalating fines, and only after all that, legal action through civil court. Sharon had done none of that. She'd simply decided on her own authority to take my property. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks later. I attended, sitting in the courtroom as Sharon, dressed in an expensive suit and flanked by her attorney, pled not guilty. Her lawyer argued that she'd been enforcing legitimate community standards and had no intent to permanently deprive me of my property. Therefore, it wasn't theft. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Assistant DA Rebecca Foster, dismantled that argument piece by piece. She presented evidence that Sharon had refused to disclose the location of the tank, even when informed it was creating a life-threatening situation. She showed that Sharon had acted unilaterally without HOA board approval. She demonstrated that Sharon had created false documentation to justify her actions. Most damningly, she pointed out that Sharon had hidden the tank off-site in a location only she knew about, showing clear intent to exercise control over my property against my will. The judge, a stern man in his 60s named Judge Robert Morrison, listened to both sides and then denied bail reduction. Mrs. Whitmore, the evidence suggests you deliberately created a life-threatening situation for Mr. Keller during a severe weather emergency. The fact that you claim HOA authority for your actions doesn't mitigate the seriousness of what you did. You stole someone's heating system in sub-freezing temperatures and then refused to return it even when informed of the danger. I'm frankly appalled. Sharon's face went pale. Her attorney immediately requested a continuance to discuss plea options, which was granted. Over the next several weeks, I watched as Sharon's life unraveled. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her as president. An investigation into HOA finances revealed that she'd been spending HOA funds on personal expenses, including her legal fees, which added embezzlement charges to her growing legal problems. Her husband Doug filed for divorce, apparently having reached his limit with her behavior. The neighborhood transformation was remarkable. Without Sharon's reign of terror, people started actually talking to each other, organizing social events, and generally acting like a normal community. A new HOA board was elected with a mandate to scale back the ridiculous rules and focus on actual community maintenance rather than petty enforcement. The criminal case moved forward slowly, as these things do. Sharon's attorney tried multiple tactics to get the charges reduced or dismissed, but nothing worked. The evidence was simply too clear. She'd stolen my property, endangered my life, and then committed multiple other crimes trying to cover it up or justify her actions. 5 months after that frozen February night, Sharon Whitmore accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to felony theft and misdemeanor reckless endangerment in exchange for the embezzlement charges being dropped. Judge Morrison sentenced her to 2 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 1 year. He also ordered her to pay full restitution for all my costs, including the emergency service calls, Bill's time, Pete's towing fees, and my increased heating costs from the house cooling down so drastically. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Morrison said during sentencing, you abused a position of trust and authority in your community. You terrorized your neighbors under the guise of maintaining property values. And most seriously, you put a man's life at risk because of your ego and your obsession with control. A propane tank can be replaced. A human life cannot. You could have killed Mr. Keller. That you don't seem to grasp the gravity of what you did troubles me greatly. I hope you'll use your time in prison to reflect on how your actions affect others. Sharon stood there, no longer the confident, commanding presence who'd ruled Pinewood Estates with an iron fist. She was just a middle-aged woman who'd let power corrupt her to the point of committing serious crimes. She said nothing, just nodded slightly as the bailiff led her away. I felt a strange mix of emotions watching her go. Satisfaction that justice had been served, certainly. Relief that she could never threaten me or anyone else in the neighborhood again. But also a kind of sad bewilderment that someone could be so consumed by petty authority that they'd risk another person's life over a property screening violation. The civil lawsuit I filed against Sharon personally, separate from the criminal case, was resolved through her homeowner's insurance. The insurance company paid out the maximum policy limit, covering not just my direct costs, but also damages for the emotional distress and the danger I'd been placed in. Sharon's house went into foreclosure during the trial, Doug having moved out during the divorce proceedings. It sold at auction, and a nice young couple moved in who actually contributed positively to the neighborhood. Life in Pinewood Estates improved dramatically after Sharon's removal. The new HOA board revised the bylaws, stripping out the most draconian rules and implementing actual democratic processes for major decisions. Monthly board meetings became transparent, with full minutes published online. The focus shifted to maintaining common areas and organizing community events, rather than scrutinizing everyone's landscaping choices. I eventually did install a decorative fence around my propane tank area, but that was my choice made for aesthetic reasons, not because anyone forced me. The fence design was my own, and nobody sent me violation notices about the style or height or paint color. It was refreshing to just be allowed to live in my own home without constant surveillance and harassment. Bill Henderson and I became good friends after the whole ordeal. He told me stories about the old days before Sharon had taken over the HOA, when it had been a much more relaxed and friendly place. Apparently, Sharon had run for HOA president 8 years ago on a platform of raising property values through strict standards enforcement. She'd won in a low turnout election where maybe 20% of residents voted. Once in power, she'd systematically consolidated control, driving off anyone who questioned her authority and stacking the board with people who wouldn't challenge her. "The thing is," Bill said one evening as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, "she probably did raise property values initially. The neighborhood did look more uniform and well-maintained. But she took it way too far, and at some point, it became about power and control rather than the actual community. That's when it becomes dangerous." He was right. There's a balance to be struck in any community between maintaining standards and respecting individual freedom. Sharon had obliterated that balance, ruling through fear and intimidation. The fact that it took her nearly killing someone through theft of heating fuel during a blizzard to finally face consequences was somewhat disturbing. How many smaller abuses of power go unchallenged because people don't want the hassle of fighting back? The story made local news, and I gave a couple of interviews to the Duluth newspaper about the experience. Other HOA horror stories started coming out of the woodwork as people felt emboldened to share their own experiences. There was even some discussion at the state legislature about HOA reform, though I don't know if anything concrete came of that. Bureaucracy moves slowly, and there are always bigger priorities competing for attention. One interesting development came about 6 months after Sharon's sentencing. I was contacted by an attorney representing a class action lawsuit against Sharon by former Pinewood Estates residents. Apparently, multiple families who'd moved away over the years had been driven out by Sharon's harassment, and they were seeking damages. I agreed to be part of the lawsuit, and provide testimony about my experience. That case was still pending last I heard, but Sharon was facing serious financial consequences beyond the criminal penalties. The strangest moment came about 8 months after the whole incident. I received a letter forwarded through the court system. It was from Sharon, writing from prison. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was not an apology. Instead, it was a rambling, largely incoherent justification of her actions. She claimed that I should be thanking her for caring about property values. She said that if everyone had just followed the rules, none of this would have happened. She insisted that she'd been within her rights as HOA president, and that the criminal justice system had failed to understand the importance of community standards. She ended by saying that, when she got out, she planned to write a book about her experience being persecuted for trying to maintain a beautiful neighborhood. I showed the letter to Officer Chen, who'd become something of a friend after the whole ordeal. He shook his head in amazement. "She still doesn't get it," he said. "Some people are just incapable of taking responsibility for their actions. Everything is always someone else's fault." I never responded to Sharon's letter. There was nothing to say that would penetrate her wall of delusion and self-justification. Some people are just broken in ways that can't be fixed, and Sharon Whitmore appeared to be one of them. Life moved on. Winter turned to spring, and then summer. My house ran perfectly with my propane tank safely providing heat and hot water. I installed a security camera system, not because I was paranoid, but because the experience had taught me the value of documentation. I became more involved in the HOA, attending meetings and making sure our new board stayed accountable and transparent. The neighborhood threw a block party that summer, the first in years apparently. People who'd barely spoken to each other under Sharon's regime were suddenly socializing, sharing food, and actually enjoying where they lived. Kids played in the streets without fear of violation notices being sent to their parents. Someone set up a volleyball net in a common area without filling out forms or getting permits. It felt like a community again, rather than a minimum security prison camp. I struck up a relationship with a woman named Sarah Bennett who lived 2 streets over. She was a teacher, smart and funny, who'd moved to Pinewood Estates just a year before the incident. She'd experienced enough of Sharon's tyranny to appreciate the positive changes, but hadn't been there long enough to be completely beaten down by it. We bonded over shared stories of HOA absurdity and started dating that fall. Sarah had her own Sharon story. Apparently, Sharon had cited her for having a doormat that was a non-approved color. The HOA rules specified that doormats must be neutral colors, and Sarah's doormat featured a cheerful sunflower pattern on a blue background. Sharon had declared the blue and yellow to be violations and demanded the doormat be replaced with something beige or gray. Sarah had complied at the time, not wanting trouble as a new resident, but she'd been angry about it. "I still have that sunflower doormat," Sarah told me. "It's back in front of my door now, where it belongs. Some days I look at it and think about how close I came to just giving up and moving. Sharon almost drove me out like she did so many others." These stories were common. Almost everyone in the neighborhood had at least one tale of Sharon's overreach. The crazy part was how we'd all been isolated, dealing with her tyranny individually without realizing how widespread it was. Once she was gone and people started talking, the full scope of her behavior became clear. She'd been systematically making everyone miserable for years. When Sharon became eligible for parole after serving 1 year, several of us wrote letters to the parole board opposing her release. We detailed her continued refusal to accept responsibility, as evidenced by her letters and statements. The parole board denied her release, citing her lack of remorse and her seeming inability to grasp why her actions had been wrong. She would serve the full 2-year sentence. Doug Whitmore, Sharon's ex-husband, ended up being a decent guy once out from under her influence. He started coming to neighborhood events, quiet and pleasant, nothing like the hostile presence he'd been when Sharon was in charge. He apologized to multiple people for not standing up to his wife, explaining that she'd been controlling and verbally abusive at home as well. His divorce and her imprisonment had freed him as much as it had freed the neighborhood. I knew some of what she was doing was wrong, Doug told me one evening at a neighborhood barbecue. But she had this way of making everything seem reasonable, of framing it as necessary for the greater good. And if I questioned her, she'd go off on these tirades about how I didn't appreciate everything she did, how I was undermining her authority, how the community would fall apart without her leadership. After a while, it was just easier to say nothing. I know that makes me complicit, and I'm sorry. I accepted his apology. Abuse comes in many forms, and Doug had clearly been in an abusive relationship himself. It wasn't my place to judge him too harshly. The propane tank incident became something of a local legend. People I'd never met would recognize my name and say something like, "Oh, you're the propane tank guy." It was odd being semi-famous for being the victim of theft, but it also sparked a lot of important conversations about HOA reform and the dangers of unchecked petty authority. I was invited to speak at a few local meetings about HOA governance, sharing my story as a cautionary tale. Several neighborhoods in the area ended up reviewing and revising their bylaws as a result, implementing term limits for board members and creating better oversight mechanisms. If some good came from my near-death experience, at least it wasn't entirely pointless. 2 years after the incident, Sharon was released from prison. I'd been notified in advance as the victim in her case. She was required to stay away from Pinewood Estates as part of her parole conditions and had apparently moved to Wisconsin to live with a sister. I hoped I'd never hear from or about her again. Life continued to improve. Sarah and I got engaged that Christmas, and we started making plans for our future together. The neighborhood remained peaceful and pleasant, a genuine community rather than a dictatorship. Property values actually increased, proving that you didn't need an iron-fisted tyrant to maintain a desirable place to live. Turns out people prefer living in places where they're not constantly harassed and threatened. I never did forget the sheer terror of that night, though. Coming home to a freezing house in the middle of a deadly blizzard, realizing my heating fuel had been stolen, and then watching the temperature plummet while I struggled to get my property back. It was the kind of experience that sticks with you, that changes how you view the world and the people in it. The legal system worked in my case, but I knew I was lucky. If Officer Matthews and Officer Chen hadn't taken my situation seriously, if they hadn't been willing to classify it as felony theft rather than just a civil dispute, if the storm hadn't been quite so severe to make the danger obvious, Sharon might have gotten away with it. She might have returned my tank a few days later with a smug lecture about following HOA rules, faced no real consequences, and continued her reign of terror indefinitely. That thought bothered me. How many small injustices happen every day that don't rise to the level of criminal action? How many people suffer under petty tyrants who hide behind rules and bureaucracy? How many battles go unfought because the cost of fighting seems too high? These were heavy thoughts, but they also motivated me to stay involved, to pay attention, and to speak up when things weren't right. The propane tank incident had taught me that silence and compliance in the face of wrongdoing just enables the wrongdoers. Sometimes you have to fight back, even when it's difficult and scary. Bill Henderson passed away peacefully in his sleep about 3 years after the incident, at the age of 68. His memorial service was held in the Pinewood Estates common area, and it seemed like the entire neighborhood turned out. Multiple people shared stories about how Bill had helped them with various plumbing emergencies over the years, always refusing payment, just being a good neighbor. I shared the story of how he'd come out in the middle of that blizzard night to help reconnect my propane tank, risking his own safety to help me. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Sarah and I got married that spring in a small ceremony, also held in the neighborhood common area. It felt right to celebrate our future in the place where we'd both found community and friendship. The HOA, under its new reasonable management, was happy to allow it, requiring only that we clean up afterward and not damage the grass. Simple, sensible rules applied with humanity and flexibility. We bought a bigger house, still in Pinewood Estates, because despite everything, we'd grown to love the neighborhood and the people in it. Our old houses were both sold to nice families who integrated well into the community. Life moved forward in the way it does, with the dramatic events of the past fading into stories we told at gatherings, cautionary tales with happy endings. I kept in touch with Officer Chen and Officer Matthews, both of whom were promoted in the years following the incident. They told me the case had become something of a training example at the police academy, about taking seemingly civil disputes seriously and recognizing when they crossed into criminal behavior. Apparently, my case had helped several other people in similar situations get their issues properly addressed. The class action lawsuit against Sharon finally settled 5 years after the original incident. Sharon's sister's house, where she'd been living, had a judgment placed against it, and several former residents received modest financial compensation for their suffering under her HOA tyranny. It wasn't about the money for most of them, but rather the official recognition that what had been done to them was wrong. Sharon herself apparently violated her parole about 3 years into it and ended up back in prison for a few months. I never learned the details, but it didn't surprise me. People who refuse to take responsibility for their actions tend to keep making the same mistakes. These days, when I look at my propane tank, now decoratively fenced and properly maintained, I think about what it represents beyond just a heating fuel source. It's a symbol of property rights, of the importance of standing up against abuse of authority, of the value of good neighbors and dedicated law enforcement. It's a reminder that sometimes the right thing is also the hard thing, but that doesn't make it any less necessary. The neighborhood continues to thrive. We have reasonable HOA rules that are enforced with common sense and flexibility. Board meetings are well attended and transparent. Disputes are handled through discussion and mediation rather than threats and intimidation. It's amazing how much better life can be when people treat each other with basic respect and decency. Sarah and I have 2 kids now, and they're growing up in a place where they can play freely, where their doormat can be any color, where their parents don't live in fear of petty bureaucrats with too much power and not enough accountability. That's worth more than any property value increase could ever be. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten home when I did, if I'd been delayed another day or 2 by the storm. The house almost certainly would have been destroyed by frozen pipes. I might have lost everything. Sharon would likely have expressed sympathy while maintaining she'd done nothing wrong, and without my immediate confrontation and the obvious danger of the blizzard, the police might not have taken it as seriously. Timing matters. Luck matters. But so does being willing to fight for what's right, even when you're exhausted and scared and it would be easier to just give up. The propane tank incident taught me that lesson in a way I'll never forget. As I write this, almost 6 years after that frozen February night, life is good. The neighborhood is peaceful. My family is happy and healthy. The propane tank sits exactly where it should be, keeping my home warm through another Minnesota winter. And somewhere, hopefully, Sharon Whitmore has finally learned that authority without accountability is just tyranny, and tyranny always fails in the end. The block parties continue every summer. The kids play volleyball in the common area. Doormats bloom in unauthorized colors on front steps across the neighborhood. And every February, when the snow falls and the temperature drops, I check my propane tank level and smile, grateful for the warmth, the safety, and the simple freedom to live in my own home without fear. That's the real ending to the story, not the dramatic arrest or the trial or even the sentencing. The real ending is the quiet restoration of normalcy, the triumph of common sense over petty tyranny, and the reminder that sometimes standing up against injustice, even when it's cold and difficult and scary, is exactly what needs to happen. Because if we don't stand up for ourselves and each other, who will?